So I think that to deal with Kierkegaard's thought may be challenging, since he didn't want to be a systematic philosopher. His thought has evolved during the years, and the use of pseudonyms may make his real position about the different philosophical issues kinda ambiguous, being discoherent with his philosophical approach. In the point of view for my work as an author, anyway, Kierkegaard gave the key to read this production, and he states that it's entirely religious, and the aim of it all is the becoming Christian. So there is actually a common denominator. So for this presentation, I have consulted works written in different periods of Kierkegaard's production. Therefore, there may not be a true continuity between them, especially because I am referring both to pseudonymous and edifying works. However, I found some topos I consider fundamental in Kierkegaard's conception of love, because sometimes even the pseudonymous works would propose some motifs that Kierkegaard, for example, in his journals, brings up a lot. So, for example, the principle of sub contraria specie. Oops. So, according to Kierkegaard, love is rooted in human beings and it belongs essentially to them. It's therefore innate. Kierkegaard thought highlights the processes that occur during existence, so it's unlikely to find in his thought concepts or elements that are given. Existence is articulated in temporality. The essential love cannot have the final form from the beginning. Otherwise, man would not need faith or redemption. So yes, love is rooted in human nature, as we can read in works of love, because actually God put love in humans, but this is not the Christian love. So I would say the final form, but I'm not referring to some Hegelian dialect, for example. I'm referring to some qualitative dialect that some secondary, that's the critics of Kierkegaard seldom use. And so I would like to highlight the process that occurs in the evolution of love. So the kind of love Kierkegaard talks about is peculiar. And first of all, it cannot really be separated from God, since God is love, as the scriptures say. And Kierkegaard remarks that in many passages, for example, in works of love, but that's not it, of course. And love is even the main attribute of God, and it has a substantial feature. So the language has given expression to the substantial element that is found in this attribute. So I think that when we refer to Kierkegaard's love, we cannot prescind from God, because God is love, and this equation is a constant through all the Kierkegaard's thought. Love is central, and it's not meant as the natural man would conceive it. Of course, love in man has a divine origin, because God has placed it in humans and has established how it is determined. So the immediate form of love is more of a pagan form of love than the Christian one. And this is not the one that Kierkegaard aims the Christian to receive. In Kierkegaard stands constant the contraposition between the merely human conception of what love is and the divine conception. Between humanity and God, there is an infinite qualitative difference, and that's a paradigm that has had wide critical reception in theology. I'm thinking about Karl Barth, for example, for which the natural pagan world cannot immediately reach what it is in accordance with God's criteria. For example, men consider love a relation between men, forgetting the fact God is the middle term. So once again, God appears in the relation of love and cannot be ignored when it comes to analyzing Kierkegaard's conception of love. And in general, there is an issue when it comes to the meaning of words, because in the Gospel of Sufferings, for example, Kierkegaard deliberates the human use of language is not adequate, apart from the use of one single man, being that Christ, the one who the whole generation agrees to reject. And actually, I think it's interesting. He does not say the problem is the language itself, but its use. But I still have to dig into it, but I would like to understand more. So if you have suggestions, please, I'm all ears. I would love to know how Kierkegaard conceives language and its nature, apart from the use that's incorrect, apart from the Christ use, of course. And so the language usually reflects the worldly conception of words, but Christians should take on a new perspective based on the revelation principle of sub contraria specie. God manifests himself sub contraria specie, so he reveals himself the opposite way than he is. For example, he reveals himself in hiddenness, being this a paradox. I do not want to say anything that's definitive about Kierkegaard's position on Luther, but I think we can affirm he has emphasized the motive of the Deus absconditus, which appears in Isaiah 45:15, and that Luther took up in his theology, and that sets many fundamental coordinates of Kierkegaard's work. The word revelation may make us think something that was hidden comes out in a noticeable and recognizable way, but Christianity subsists in paradox. Therefore, the revelated God is a hidden God. The reason of the inversion is time and eternity, finite and infinite, are qualitatively heterogeneous. Thus, for example, the via eminentiae, which ascribes attributes to God to the highest degree, is disqualified because there is a breakpoint between the two dimensions. Though we will see this separation is not irreversible, unity can be restored precisely thanks to love. So maybe this is something in the 20th century has not been highlighted enough, because maybe in the, that's my opinion, during the Kierkegaard Renaissance, the divorce between the two dimensions has been really brought up, but without saying how the two dimensions may be linked through faith, through love. This is a spoiler. And so back to the revelation, since God is love and God's revelation occurs sub contraria specie, then love reveals itself sub contraria specie. And the way love is delineated in Kierkegaard confirms that. Indeed, Kierkegaard says suffering is love. This is love seen through the lens of sub contraria specie. Cornelio Fabro, that has been an Italian philosopher and theologian, outlines a dialectical relation between love and suffering in his introduction to Works of Love, where love and suffering are two opposite poles that don't need to end up in a third element, in a third Hegelian moment, for example, the synthesis, but they interrelate and they deepen each other. So the more the love, the more the suffering. There is no passage or overcome between them. In Kierkegaard's Papirer, it is explicitly said that God loves you, and that's why you need to suffer. And since you're suffering, God loves you. Of course, that you need to suffering does not mean a necessity that could be conceived by Hegel, for example, or something that's deterministic. Of course, in Kierkegaard, the free will of the single individual is fundamental. And this is really interesting when it comes to the attribute of God's being omnipotent, because this attribute isn't a problem when it comes to humans' free will. God cannot express his love in another way because he is spirit, and with him it's impossible to establish an immediate relation. Therefore, there cannot be sensible or immediate certainty about God wanting to use the believer as an instrument for his purpose. The suffering cannot be rationally justified. There is no sure correlation between the suffering and God's will. Faith soars above the arguments of reason. It's a bet, and this kind of recalls Blaise Pascal's thought. The role of reason in determining the field where faith may act is preeminent anyway, so we cannot include Kierkegaard among the fideist tradition, even if I know this is really debated since, for example, he rejects the proof of existence of God, but this, in my opinion, does not disqualify the role of reason, even in the proofs of God's existence, because reason is the one who meets the limit, but it has to meet the limit, so that can allow faith to soar among the dialectic. So God is love does not just mean that God loves. No, of course. Kierkegaard says the promise always implies the duty. God is to be loved. The figure which truly fulfills the human duty to love God is the apostle. His condition perfectly combines love and suffering because he experiences true horror during his life, a kind of death that keeps him alive, and that's even worse than actual death. He lives in permanent pain and does not receive any help for his life on earth, differently than the Old Testament characters. Since in the Old Testament, many times we see that God interfered with the characters' actions, and he lent a hand when it came to some material help. And well, this does not happen at all in the New Testament. And this apparent condemnation is instead the greatest blessing, because Christians need to use the lens of sub contraria specie when they analyze reality. So the apostle gains access to the existential categories that express the inversion of sub contraria specie, that are mortification, self-denial, suffering for the doctrine. And actually, for the doctrine is a key point here, because Christians are not the only ones who suffer in this world, of course. Bad things happen to pagans, for example, and in general to everyone. But this one is not the kind of suffering Kierkegaard talks about. The apostle suffers for the doctrine, for the word of the Lord, and the voluntary element is fundamental, unless suffering would be contingent. And of course, here the free will has to take action again, unless the existence, what is contingent, would lose its value. To suffer because of doctrine is a voluntary act that aims to annihilate, to destroy the subject's will so it can make room for God's infinite will. And in the third part of verse Kierkegaard analyzes the biblical passage where the Holy Spirit brings its gift during the Pentecost. The Gospel of John states, "It is the Spirit who gives life." This statement does not suggest Christianity is a joyful consolation, or at least it's not just that, as if the Spirit could come and unconditionally give life. The apostle must die to the word and to himself. He must reject everything that has material or worldly determinations in order to embrace the Spirit who gives life and brings gifts such as faith and love. Faith in its strictest sense subsists only after death. Kierkegaard even says that faith, on the other hand, is death. The death to the self is related to the death to the world, because it's through selfishness that the world has power over the single individual. This one is the most painful death that could occur, but to lose apparently everything is necessary to gain it in a divine perspective. Through their sacrifice, the apostles save the world and join with God, continuing in love. So we can see in this for self-examination passage, the life-giving spirit is the very one who slays you. The first thing the life-giving spirit says is that you must enter into death, that you must die too. So it's been said that the love of God requires hatred towards the world, and this point may easily lead to some misunderstanding. Hate seems to be incompatible with love, so here there should be a contradiction. Apart from the fact that according to Kierkegaard's journals, life itself is contradiction, so it may be ambiguous to use logic to describe reality. Even the relationship between Kierkegaard and Hegel is not crystal clear, since while Kierkegaard was determined to oppose him, there seems to be some kind of continuity between the two, such as in the conception of contradiction being real. And the solution here, by the way, can be pretty easy. The Christian hate is not a misanthropy, as Kierkegaard says in his journals. Once again, we should refer to the inversion that happens in language, whereby Christian hate does not mean wishing men ill, etc., but it is exactly the opposite, so loving them in the idea, infinitely wishing them well. And this is why, in my opinion, it's not that evident to set off how love contributes in the good of others in Kierkegaard's thought, because it definitely depends on the perspective assumed when weighing the amount of good. So, for example, Kierkegaard was so grateful to his father because he made him be the unhappiest person in the world. So when we speak about the contributory aspects of love, I actually find some difficulties, since I do not know which language is implied here. If the language seen by the divine perspective, so the true meaning of word, or the worldly meaning of, for example, love and good, happiness, etc. So Christianity, in practicing Christianity, is defined as the absolute because God wills it out of love. God is the one who wills, and one of the main God's attributes is his immutability. In his relation with humans, he is both the subject and the object of love. These metaphysical terms, subject and object, do not really fit in this context, I know, but they are practical at the extent they represent the mutual relationship with the divine. So God doesn't change in either case. In either case, when he is the object, so when he is loved, he must be loved for who he is. He cannot be transformed for any reason to please man. He can't be in likeness of man, so out of love, he wills to shape man. Even when he is the subject, he doesn't modify his substance. One of the differences between earthly and divine love lies here. The lover usually changes himself in the likeness of the loved one, becoming who the loved one could desire or want. Of course, God's way of loving is completely other. In God lives the contradiction of being love and, simultaneously, eternally immutable. The sentence contained in journals, God must in a sense make the beloved unhappy, projects us in the practice of Christianity Christ's invitation. Come here to me, all you who labor and are burdened, and I will give you rest. This invitation belongs to Gospel of Matthew, and at the first reading, it may seem the emphasis falls on the rest part. It is more complicated than that, since the paradox must be brought up. Kierkegaard thinks that if the inviter wants to gather all of the sufferers, he should remove the difference between him and them. If the invited were one exception could be made, so the sufferer could change his status. But this is not the case. Here, the inviter addresses his invitation to every sufferer, so he does not modify their condition, but he becomes miserable himself. This is exactly what happens in the kenosis when occurred the incarnation. God did not come in glory, he became a servant. He lived in the very same manner, poor as the poorest, poorly regarded as the lowly man among the people, experienced in life's sorrow and anguish. The suffering Christ has undergone was totally real. He wasn't a phantom. His flesh was substantial, real, to the point he died on the cross, carrying out the extreme paradox of the death of God. Therefore, to accept the invitation of the promised rest is the greatest misery. The future is not going to be carefree, but the exact opposite. The cross is going to be secured, not left aside. The earthly misery is absolutely more bearable than what coming to Christ implies. Christ's life represents the model a believer should imitate as if he were Christ's contemporary. There is only one aspect a Christian cannot constitutively imitate of Christ's life, his death leading to redemption. The imitation itself is difficult to be performed. Therefore, a Christian should pray God not to be relieved of suffering, since this wouldn't be inscribed in God's love, but to get help to resist and to stand suffering again. It is Christ who has brought suffering in the world, suffering that includes the possibility of scandal for the sufferer. To become contemporary with Christ is to truly become Christians. So to be transformed into likeness with God, the greatest misery, as it reported in practice in Christianity. Again, we face the paradox. The revealed God is more incomprehensible than the unrevealed God. The God of love has not come to simplify or even abolish the law, to spread a mediocre love, or to be more clement than the God of love or law. Rather, in works of love, the life of love appears to be hidden, and its source is secret. You cannot see this place. However deeply you penetrate, the origin eludes you in remoteness and hiddenness. There is no immediate clarity in God of love. Kierkegaard, though, does not merely describe the terrible human condition or similia without seeing any light. The difference between Judaism and Christianity lies in the different relation to eternity. There cannot be victory in this life, but the reward invades eternity. The absolute, states Kierkegaard, consists in choosing eternity. Here lies the possibility of scandal, because reason meets her limit. Christianity is not commensurable with any finite why, so all of this sounds like insanity to reason. Anyway, eternity is not a dimension totally inaccessible to man. In Kierkegaard, we do not face a Manichaean dualism between time and eternity, existing and being, human and God. For sure, an abyss separates them, but there is the possibility of connection. What is it, namely, that connects the temporal and eternity? What else but love, which for that very reason is before everything and remains after everything is gone? Love is the point of contact, what allows the qualitative leap. The fracture of sin may be healed even if there is no analogy between God and man through love. It is significant Kierkegaard titled his writing Works of Love, actually, anchoring love to the becoming of existence and the single individual's task. Love is known by his fruit, his life is hidden, but it is manifest that his fruit has within itself eternity's truth. This is the reward a Christian must desire, also because God put in every man an eternity principle. God cannot be totally other, because man is not a complete stranger to eternity. The Christian message suggests the affinity of the human and godly essence. The duty a Christian should fulfill, it asks to love the neighbor, involves the same field of the God's nature, since God is love. So Christians can be God's co-workers in love. In particular, a believer should love the neighbor, because who loves the neighbor is determined purely as spirit, and the neighbor is a purely spiritual determination. In that relationship occurs the equality of eternity, since the difference has been removed and every man has equally access to God. Then another aspect I would like to highlight is the unity one concerning God and human. There are many directions, or maybe point of view. Love operates as unity. It links time and eternity, who loves the neighbor and God. Here, the topic of the model is brought up, and in the Gospel of Sufferings, it's said that it's necessary that God disappears, otherwise faith wouldn't have value. So if God were openly present, Christianity would be like paganism with some exotic features, God being recognizable, but Christianity is based on the paradox, and if we remove the paradox, then we remove Christianity. So faith is the only one who is able to untangle the paradox. And of course, this does not mean that the contemporaries with Christ had some advantages in recognizing Christ because he was present, because he was actually present. No, everybody could have their difficulties. In fact, they killed him. And the only difference may be the grace that's been given to the apostles. But then both the contemporary man than the actual Christian should afford the same battle to gain faith, since God was not recognizable even when he was in the earth. And since a true Christian should aim to be a contemporary with Christ now, time doesn't really matter, because in the perspective of eternity, time flies by and hasn't got really a full ontological status, let's say. So a person should begin with loving the unseen God, because then he himself will learn what it is to love. But that he actually loves the unseen will be known by his loving the brother he sees. The more he loves the unseen, the more he will love the people he sees. Once again, I was fascinated with this paradoxical trait of Kierkegaard's philosophy, because usually, even with children, we think, maybe we could naturally think that it's easier to approach the figure of Christ because he has been a man. So we could learn to love by loving the neighbor, then Christ, then God, as if this was a stair. But again, Kierkegaard operates the inversion. So a person should begin with loving the unseen. So it definitely eliminates the immediate trait that this dialectic could have. So if we started from what's seen, we could do the same operation Hegel did in the phenomenology of spirit. So we could start with the sensible certainty, then to remove it and to move forward in the dialectic. But here Kierkegaard does the opposite. And he says, in fact, that a person should begin with loving the unseen, God, because when a person loves God, he receives the measure of love, that is a measure that cannot be measurable to any reality, both in direct and inverse proportion. This is said in Fear and Trembling, but there are many other excerpts when the same concept is said. So many times Kierkegaard says that we cannot measure the good or love because the counterweight would be eternity, and we cannot measure with eternity as a counterweight. Then actually Christianity is the absolute, as we saw before, and I think that to measure something we should relate what's measured to our, for example, way of measuring. But if something is the absolute, how can we really measure it? How can we relate to the absolute with our means? That would be impossible. So in Works of Love, Kierkegaard says the essentially Christian is this: truly to love oneself is to love God. Truly to love another person is with every sacrifice, also the sacrifice of becoming hated oneself to help the other person to love God or in loving God. So I think this sums up almost everything that's been said until now, because we cannot present from God when we think about loving the neighbor, even in a static relationship, I think. And we have the element of the sacrifice, the sacrifice of becoming hated oneself, that highlights the trait of paradox that is living in love's conception. This is some partial primary source I got. Thank you.